Welcome to the Riff. Today, Preston Ulmer sits down with Justin Bryeans to talk about isolation and being lonely. We hope that it's helpful. Thanks for listening.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Riff. Thanks for listening in. Obviously, you're not hearing Jeremy Johnson's voice. This is Preston Ulmer. I am the Springfield campus pastor with North Point Church. I am actually the guest host this week for the Riff. So if you sent this to your friends and you told them you got to hear Jeremy riff on a bunch of different topics and you sent them this week's episode, they're going to send it back confused. But keep listening. I think we'll have a good episode in store. We're going to have a guest with us. His name is Justin Bryeans. And let me tell you something about Justin. Justin has become a really good friend. He's a pastor out in the Seattle area on Bainbridge Island. It's a beautiful little getaway. If you want to get away with your loved one, take a ferry from Seattle over to Bainbridge Island. And Justin will be there waiting for you. He pastors out there. He also is a spiritual director. He's someone who, what we'll talk about in a little bit, he's a soul friend to so many. And so, Justin, thanks for being on this podcast with us today.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to have you. And here's the deal. Justin and I have had many conversations about a ton of different topics. And I only wish we were recording them as podcasts so many other times. But this one, hopefully this is as good as sitting in a hot tub and talking about life, okay? But neither of us are in hot tubs and we both have our shirts on this time. But it'll be good. It should be good. The topic we're going to talk about is, why do Christians feel so lonely? It seems like a big topic. But Justin, the reason I want to talk about this with you is you do give language to these things that feel kind of cliche. You give new, refreshing language to those things. But loneliness, we all talked about it in the pandemic. And then now that we're kind of in a post-pandemic world, I guess you could say, loneliness is still at an all-time high. And I've wondered, I like asking questions. I've wondered, why are Christians, why are they so lonely if we're supposed to be all about community? We're supposed to be the ones in communion with God. So we're supposed to be the ones physically around people, spiritually connected. But statistically, and we'll put some of the resources with the stats in the notes section on the podcast, statistically, Christians aren't all that more connected than people who aren't following God. Why? So just riff on that a little bit. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, there's so many angles we can take with that, but I think a fairly core one is that at least so many of the folks I've met, they have given themselves to following the way of Jesus. They've given themselves to working with their local community of Jesus followers, right? They've immersed themselves in it. They've done so much good work. Really common every time I hear this language. They've tried all the prescriptions, but those things don't actually give them any more sense of belonging, I would say, with God, with themselves, or with others. And I think we could, again, unpack that a lot of different ways. But I think one of the reasons is a lot of folks feel they've been handed these things that don't fit. It's like if I sent you a shirt and it was like my daughter Lucy's size, well, that'd be crazy anyway to send you Lucy's, but you know what I mean? If you tried to put it on, that would not fit you. And I think a lot of folks I talk to feel like they fit them. And I can't tell you how many conversations I've had about that. I'll give you an example, if I may. And I think it's often well-meaning in intention, but I can't tell you how many people I've met that when they hit a wall with something of this sense of isolation or loneliness or disconnection, someone might say something akin to, hey, just read your Bible and pray more, right? Mm-hmm. And it's well-meaning, and the Bible and prayer are great, but they're kind of like, I've tried that. Like, it doesn't in its own right bring me connection. And I think I think there's a lot of attempts to give a quick prescription, almost like an over-the-counter medicine. But there hasn't been time to let who that person is, their own life story, the way they conceive of God, the way they live in the world, that be known, be heard, be understood within this big sweep, that the God who's revealed in Jesus is the one who says things like, oh, come to me, right? Like they haven't had that invitation. It feels like with so many of the conversations I've had. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. So what you're saying, I mean, if I'm someone who's listening to this podcast, what I just heard you say might feel, I mean, this is the podcast. It might feel a little offensive in that they're like, wait, that's what I've been doing. I've been going to church. I've been praying. I've been reading the Bible. And what you're saying, I've heard you say so many times that the assumptions that we have about how we experience God might actually get in the way of truly experiencing God in people. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and there's an Irish poet I like, and he had the language of morning prayer where he even said, may the God I meet today be bigger than the God that I actually think I'm even praying to, right? Because it's the notion that we get trapped in a really small packaging when the God of the universe has revealed himself in so many ways. Let me give you a couple more handles that might be helpful, because I want to make it clear to whoever's listening. I think things like prayer, I think things like engaging with a community of Jesus followers, opening the scriptures, they're life-giving, no doubt. An example would be, though, I have friends, I'll use the Bible one for an example. They've tried to read the scripture the way maybe someone prescribed it to them, to get to know God, to feel a sense of connection with God, life with God. And the prescribed way, they just felt this kind of like they were hitting their head against the wall. Well, then we started talking about it. And after listening, I'm like, oh, what if you tried this? And I didn't make anything up. I just borrowed from what I would call the big library that Jesus followers have been creating throughout the centuries of ways to engage scripture. And so I just literally pulled one of those ways off the shelf, if you will, and said, what if we try this one? And that particular one opened up a whole new way of meeting God through scripture, and they felt a connection they never had. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. The quick prescription stuff seems to be overused. How's that?
Yes. It sounds like the type of Christianity where we just say, here's all the resources you need to feel connected to God. Go be lonely all over again, now with more to do. It's like,
right.
It's like loneliness.
Right. More to do. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think loneliness goes away just by adding more to do. So would you say if someone's listening and they would say,
no,
if they say, I feel lonely, I feel alone, I feel socially isolated, I feel people don't see me. Are you saying the way to move forward then is to go into some spiritual practices? Or are you saying it is to engage the things that you knew? What do people do?
Yeah, that is such a big and good question. And I would say this with a lot of care for anyone who is in that space right now. I do think it could include spiritual practices, but I think before that, even why I'm pausing is I'm deeply hopeful that even if it's an unlikely person, that everyone could maybe pause, take a breath, and look around and see who is already in my my connected life, if you will, who's already within this kind of social universe, even though I feel estranged or distant or lonely. And maybe it's a person you don't even know super well, but they've embodied something where you might take a risk and even say, hey, can we chat or go for a walk or grab a cup of coffee or something? Yeah. And I know that's so simplistic in one way, but I really would hope that if you find yourself in that place, the first thing is there is a risk. There is a kind of a big lifting moment, if you will. I think to take an action like that, but I couldn't say it enough. And I do think there are practices and other things, but I think within the context of at least with another person, and you and I've talked a lot about that, the idea of who are we companioning with, who can be that soul friend to us, things of that nature.
Talk about that phrase. I love that phrase, soul friend, because what you're talking about actually is deep connection to other people. I don't think that we get out of loneliness by more Bible studies on the topic or going into our prayer closet. I think if anything, we're drilling down on, we're going to get more frustrated, right? If we start to do stuff like that. But this idea of a soul friend, what's that term? Where does that come from?
No, that's so good. And I'd love to play off what you just said and get there. And you kind of even connected, I think, some of the stuff I was just saying a moment ago. When you were talking, it made me think, it's like in Matthew's gospel, one of the biographies of Jesus we have, right? The New Testament. Mm-hmm. I think it's chapter 11. Eugene Peterson created kind of his life work that some of us who read the Bible call the Message. Mm-hmm. And in that rendering, he has Jesus rightfully saying, hey, are you tired? Are you worn out? Are you burned out on religion? Come to me. And he has all this language, get away with me. You'll recover your life. And he has this invitation, like, walk with me, watch with me, learn like the unforced rhythms of grace alongside of me. And I wanted to say that because that's what we're talking about when we name having a soul friend. That idea a moment ago, I said it may be a risk, but reaching out to another who would walk slow enough with us where our own life can actually be noticed and discovered. And so to push a little further, that soul friend language, I mean, it's been around for centuries. There's an old Celtic term, anam cara, that literally means soul friend. And that use of it was the person you would tell your stuff to, right? Like the person you would have real talk with and get stuff off your chest and confess to and be free with. And I actually think we see it all over the place in Jesus. I think post-resurrection, he's walking on the Emmaus Road as a soul friend. I think we see it in the text I just mentioned. I think we see it even in the God who's revealed in Jesus early on when he says, humans aren't made to be alone. Yeah. And even that text in Genesis is often referred to in only marriage context as too small. I think what's being stated is we are made to walk with another. So maybe just a couple other quick things on the soul friend. I like to think of it like this. Someone who will walk with you at your speed. And by the way, there's a Japanese theologian that wrote an interesting book on that called The 3 Mile Per Hour God. The idea is we walk about 3 miles per hour. So who's walking with you at your speed? Or who do you get to walk with at their speed? And someone who is on the journey to listen, to be really curious about your life, to ask questions as they listen. And the whole point of it, though, is not to fix you. It's not to give you more to do, like you just said a moment ago, Preston. It's actually to pay attention to your flourishing, your connection with the God who loves you beyond describing. That's what a soul friend does. And it's, again, a centuries old practice, sometimes called spiritual direction, companionship, etc. But that's kind of the essence of it.
That's totally different than handing someone resources, telling them to come join a large community once a week. I mean, it's not what I was going to say is it's not easy. It's not fast.
No. That's a good point. Yeah.
I think that it takes the things we love to keep to ourselves, time, even curiosity. We want curiosity to be about our life and our interests. It truly is a different way of dying to self. So in that way, I mean, Justin, you've been a soul friend to many. You is it because that someone's done it with you? What has created that? Yeah. What has caused that to be so natural to you?
Two things come to mind. The first answer is yes, people have done that for me. You and I've had a chance to talk, and I'll give the short version. probably about a decade ago, I was doing a lot of good things, and they were things that I wanted to do. They were things I felt compelled or called or, made to do. But I hit this wall of being a shell of myself. And you and I've talked about that. I mean, I was thinking, and I'm an extrovert, right? So like that was really abnormal for me. Withdrawing and even leaning into a lot of medicating practices, actually. And in the midst of that, I had a good friend. We were walking together through life who really, I would say, embodied that way that we're talking about. And I'm not trying to be dramatic, or I don't want to overstate it, but I think that saved my life. Like, I think in the fullest sense, right? I'm not who I am today without that. And then when I thought of him, I can think back to other key moments where I've been graced with people like that. But that moment was particular. And then I'll tell you a moment though that, okay, you can do with this what you will, but I remember being 5 years old and my family moved into a new apartment complex. Okay. My mom had just married the guy who became my dad. He adopted my sister and I. And I remember I kind of became known for this, what happens next. So I walked down to the park where the pool's at, and I just kind of shout out to all the kids, hey, you want to be my friend? Got up some kids, took them home for snacks. And, why I say that is I think there is something in my story where I think it's a part of the way I'm made to spend my life. Does that make sense? I don't think it makes me any better or unique in that way, but I do think the older I get and lean into this way more, I almost feel like I see a thread like, oh, I think this is kind of part of what I'm made to do in the world. Yeah. So yeah. And then I was graced again with people stepping in and embodying that so well. So yeah.
So it's something that you feel alive when you're doing it.
Right? Oh, totally. It's my favorite thing.
So let me ask you this. Do you think other people made in the image of God would feel alive by doing the same thing?
100%.
Well,
100%.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's what we're made for, and not to go over the top, but even the one we call God, right? Father, Son, and Spirit exists in an everlasting community, right? Where there's always enough belonging.
Yeah.
I mean, they never get tired of each other. And I know I'm using they and the whole mystery of the, Trinity. I'm there, but
yeah.
But I think why I mentioned that is I think that's a snapshot, a reminder, maybe a provocation for some. That's the life we're made for. And I think we live around some of the most curious people because actually on some level, all people are like just full of wonder. And I think there's something about walking with another, listening, asking questions. It just lights you up.
Yeah.
And I think if I could add this too, I actually have seen the benefit of even that practice in the relationships that I care the most about. It's funny, I don't get with my wife or my kids or my best friends and say, and in my brain, like I'm doing spiritual direction with you or being this with you. But that way is seeped into my life, and I think my relationships are better for it.
It's an incredible thing. Everyone listening, I wish you could sit with Justin, have a cup of coffee, and you would experience what it's like to have someone totally curious about you and asking you questions. It makes you wonder, where is God at work in my life? And I think that when it comes to loneliness, what we've done is, you can feel so lonely in a crowd full of other people. I mean, loneliness is a perspective of how you're showing up, how nobody knows you, those sort of things. It's isolation.
Yeah.
It's all those things. And I was reading a study recently. Again, we'll put anything I'm referencing, some of the books that you're referencing, we'll put those in the notes in the podcast. I was reading a study that was talking about loneliness, whether it's objective loneliness, like almost diagnosed, or subjective loneliness, self-diagnosed, saying this is the way I'm feeling. that there's a study that was done with over 3 million participants. Okay, I think it's 3,700,000. It's up there. And it was over the course of 7 years. And what they found is whether it's objective loneliness or subjective loneliness, that loneliness is worse than smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It causes the mortality rate of the effects of loneliness is higher than obesity in America. Mm. So we're seeing, as you're talking about, hey, God's wired us in a way for deep one-on-one, one-on-two, whatever, consistent connection. He's wired us in that way.
Yeah.
Our bodies will feel the after effects of choosing not to participate in the way that we're wired.
Yes. No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we both have even talked about that. Yeah. I think I've experienced it at past times in my life. I've seen it with friends, the physical implications, like the holistic impact it has. It's heavy. Yeah.
Yeah. It's heavy. Okay. So tell me, how would you describe it in all the ways you've been a soul friend to people and all the ways you've walked alongside them in what you've learned, even in your spiritual practice and direction and school and teaching, all of those experience and education, the two come together. Help us understand, what is loneliness? People usually can't put a definition to it. They just, they'll say, I feel alone. I don't feel connected to. What is it? What's this thing that's sweeping across Christian, non-Christian?
I'll use an analogy that actually helped connect the dots for me.
Yeah.
So that my wife and I, we have 4 kids, and we adopted our 3rd son. And throughout that journey, I had a lot to learn that I just was unaware of about things, particularly like attachment. And I think anyone who may be even listening, who whether it's foster care, adoptive work, or things like that, are quite probably aware of how important that is and how much work goes into that, and just how sweeping the notion of human attachment. Here's what I want to admit. I think loneliness is when we feel a sense of broken attachment with God, with ourselves, and with others.
Wow.
I mean, I think that's probably one of the most straightforward ways I've probably put language to it.
Wow. Broken attachment to God and to ourselves and others. And then we probably get frustrated because it's so broken that when there's a cliches or typical Christian answers, it's like a Band-Aid on a deep wound.
Yeah. Or even it maybe not even a Band-Aid, maybe even another wound on top of a wound. And again, as we stated earlier, that wasn't the intent by the person giving it. So we hold those two together, but that can be the effect.
Wow. Broken attachment. So you're saying brokenness between us and God, you can feel it. It can be felt.
Yep.
Brokenness between us and others, and brokenness between us and ourselves. That's like a whole lifetime of work, Justin. I don't want to do a lifetime of work of feeling like I can be attached to all those things. That feels hard.
Yeah, I mean, it can be, but I would say they're interrelated is the cool thing, in the sense that there may be some listening. You might identify with this. If you don't, you might know a friend who does. I remember being in my teen years growing up. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and there's so much about it I loved. But I remember growing up there, and when I think of things like this broken attachment with God, for instance, a lot of that was driven by, I'm going to use the term caricatures for God that I was handed.
Okay.
And again, I think often by well-meaning friends and people, but I had heard forever God loved, but I probably had a deep sense that I didn't think God liked me very much. Well, like think about our own relationships and friendships. That would break an attachment, right? And so when I think to have and connected to some of the sense of detachment from ourselves, the scripts that play under the surface, right? Some it's you're not good enough, you got to work harder, you got to prove it. The scripts that we pick up along the way of our life. What's interesting is in Jesus, and even I mentioned, for instance, the Matthew 11 invitation, we find a whole other God. And so I think when we think about attachment with God and ourselves and even others, they're intertwined to the point that those things can often be, I don't know the best word, but we'll find wholeness coming not by attack one time, but because haven't people said it forever, theologians, etc. When we know God, we know ourselves. When we know ourselves, we know God. That you can find that in every era. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I think they're interrelated. And I think that's where some of the practices, some of the ways of leaning in to letting a new experience with the God who shows up in Jesus reframe that for us. And I think it is a lifetime endeavor. I just want to play my cards. I don't think it's a quick fix. I think it's going to take a minute. So yeah.
Well, it seems like the simplicity of love God, love others as you love yourself. Yeah. That's a repeated theme throughout Jesus's parables, throughout his actual words, and throughout his life. And so he committed his life to it, and it was the purpose and the fulfillment of his life. Truly, there would be no other endeavor that I think we would want to give ourselves to.
Yeah.
Right? When I think of loneliness, this is obviously when we talk about how lonely it was during the pandemic, all those things. I don't know when we stop talking about that. Maybe we're going to be the old men who are telling our grandkids, back in 2020 when the pandemic happened, I'll tell you what loneliness was, and it's going to be the new way that we said we walked uphill both ways, But all that to say, it was an excuse. I don't want to say it's an excuse. It kind of masked, I think, this feeling that we all may have already been having, and it amplified it. But then everyone at that point was able to say, oh, okay, I feel this way because I'm socially isolated. And part of that was true. But do you think that was going on long before we were told to shelter in place?
Oh, totally. And for those who are would enjoy looking, there are so many things we can point to. There was a famous work, what was his name? Putnam, Bowling Alone. Didn't that come out in the 90s maybe?
Yeah, way before.
I'm just guessing, but I'm talking this is a very long-term thing. And I think, and I want to say this gently, I think it's because we are living in such a fast-changing point of history. And, people way smarter than me have given us clues, things like the really great devices that are even allowing us to do some of the stuff we're doing right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, I actually write code, I work in that realm too. So I'm by no means anti that, but even that technology that is so pervasive, and we don't have to go anywhere to get on the internet and do it. Someone might be listening to this and be like, wait, there was a time you had to go get on the internet? It's fascinating. You should even build modems, crazy sounds, and you had to log on. Well, it's always on now. And there are many folks who are pointing to how these rapid changes, though, they are, if you will, pitting themselves against how we're made for humans. As humans, we're not made to be everywhere all the time. We're not made to be always on. We're not made to be connected with no boundaries. And again, not trying to be too nerdy here, but even you and I talked about, take the philosophers throughout time who talked about the good life. One of the things they all talk about in their own ways, there's a virtue in limits. And so now that we have limitless, and there are really, again, brilliant folks pointing out how this is even further isolating, making us lonely, et cetera. People like, the Center for Humane Technology and such, I think they're worth checking out. Here's why I bring all that up. It's been around loneliness, but there are things that we take for granted as just part of life that can exacerbate it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I do think there's just something, I would use the term wisdom to being aware. I think of folks who've written great books, The Common Rule, Justin Bryeans, Andy Crouch, TechWise Family. There's stuff out there to help us make wise decisions that actually do address, in my opinion, our longing for connection beyond a device. Does that make sense?
Total sense. And I think that those thoughts will feel revolutionary to some and will validate others in saying, thank you for saying it. Because it just seems like the world, it's hard to live in the world without connecting digitally all the time without limits.
Right.
And people feel so out of place, but you're right. It's exacerbating the problem.
Well, and if I'm always connected to everything else, it just makes sense. And I'm telling you from experience, not an accusation towards others, but if I'm always connecting else, I'm not going to be connected to God myself. There's just not enough room, space.
Right. I don't have enough connection. Right?
Yeah.
Totally. Okay. So this part might feel like, well, how could you ask for this after discussing? It's not just a resource that you give. It's not just, so I'm not going to say what resource. I'm going to say, Justin, what next step can someone take? They're listening to this on their drive to work, or they're listening to this while getting ready in the morning. What next step can they take out of loneliness, out of broken attachment between God, themselves, and others?
Well, I think you and I both know we could have unending conversations about that. And I again respect the fact that whomever is listening, there's so much wonderful variation, right? And who's participating. So I want to offer this gently, but maybe we'll share this in the show notes. I'll send it to you.
Okay.
There's a little resource called The Daily Rhythm that I didn't come up with. Actually, I mentioned him earlier in his book, The Common Rule, a guy named Justin Bryeans. The Daily Rhythm, I think, is a practical, it is a tool, but it's not prescriptive in the sense of like how you have to do it. You get to be yourself in how you do it. But I think what the Daily Rhythm offers is those who want to try something out tangibly. See, I'm convinced our lives are a grand, beautiful experiment. So a tool like the Daily Rhythm helps me experiment with my morning practice, experiment with my meal practices. Like, do I make room to share a meal? It lets me experiment with my prayer practices. Maybe some of you listening, praying like the Lord's Prayer, that rhythmic, ongoing, over and over again prayer is life-giving. For others of you, maybe you've prayed your own prayers for a long time, but you're in a spot where I don't seem to have the words anymore. And maybe taking advantage of the prayers of God's people and the Psalms would be helpful. Or maybe it's even the prayer where I don't have to say anything, but I can sit with the God who loves me quietly and just pay attention. And let me just make a disclaimer about that one. That kind of quiet, contemplative prayer, I am seriously not great at it, but it is life-giving. Like, I get distracted so easily. But there's something about me not making it up and being with God. Here's why I mentioned all those. This Daily Rhythm tool I mentioned, like it says things like, 3 times a day prayer. So maybe you would build a rhythmic way of prayer that others have done for centuries and found really helpful in rooting them into a connectedness with the God who loves them. But maybe the way you pray, right? Maybe there's a way that you could try out that fits where you are right now. We can share those resources. The Daily Rhythm also talks about, scripture before phone. It talks about things like again, sharing a meal with others. I would encourage you to lean into something tangible where your day, the embodied stuff you give yourself to, practice ways of noticing, ways of being with God and others in that space. And again, we'll share the rhythm because again, I kind of just hit on it in part, but I would mention that. And then one other thing.
Yeah.
Okay. I would say if you're listening and this whole notion of how do I regain connection struck a chord, and I said this earlier and I may have fumbled a bit, but maybe you have a trusted friend and maybe they don't even live near you. Maybe it's a phone call, or maybe you're in a small group with some people you really love and there's nothing wrong with what I'm going to say next, but typically your small group gets together and you do a curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
Who, if it's 1 to 3, it could be more, but you get it. I actually think you could literally get together with that trusted person or persons and say, hey, can we try something? Can we set a timer for 10 minutes and we'll take turns and we'll just ask each other, hey, how are you? What are you bringing into our time together today? And then 10 minutes, just let them talk. And when the timer goes off, not because we're trying to fix, but maybe they used a phrase over and over again. Maybe they asked a question. Maybe there was a scene in their sharing that's so provocative and interesting to you. And you'd be like, hey, could you say more about that?
That's really...
And you're not giving them advice. That blessing over them, move to the next person. I would just recommend something like that too.
These are great practices because they're not prescriptive. They're not easy. They're not shallow. These are truly ways in which you can connect with people.
Yeah.
And in which that connection goes both ways. I think in the West, at least, I think that what we've done so much is prayer closet, that worship song. I don't know how old it is now, but when you walk into the room, everything changes, right? I'm like, yeah, but don't stay in a room with Jesus. It's not just you and Jesus. I mean,
right.
Even the garden showed it wasn't just Adam and God, right? That wasn't enough. There needed to be a trusted companion. And so, I just, what you just offered, even with the 10-minute timer, what you just offered is so doable. So if you're listening to the Riff this week, please make sure you check out the show notes. It's going to be an incredible asset to you. If you're listening to this while you're falling asleep and you're like, well, now I'm wide awake, just nudge your spouse next to you, set a timer and tell them to riff or not, just wait till the morning. But thanks for listening. Justin, it was a pleasure having you on, and I always look forward to seeing you, whether it's virtual or in person, and getting a cup of coffee. So thanks for that.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Riff. Submit a question for the podcast at northpointchurch.tv/podcast. We'll have a brand new episode every week wherever you find podcasts.